company was annihilated. There were no healthy Puerto Ricans walked back to our lines from Kelly Hill that night.
By morning, the men of the 65th were faced with another shocking reality. Across Kelly Hill, they could see their captured Puerto Rican comrades being used as shields while the Chinese repaired the outpost's defenses, and the gruesome sight of some of the mortally wounded survivors trying to escape downhill.
Then the wounded started crawling back to us. There was a soldier that we saw in the viciscope. He had lost the two legs and he was sitting on the helmet and pushing himself. He was, excuse me, I hate to cry, but I can't help. And we lost that whole company.
En Kelly había ocurrido una matanza. Ríos de sangre corrían por la colina Kennedy. La gran tragedia de Kelly eran los puertorriqueños viendo a sus compañeros morir sin poder hacer nada, cercados por el fuego que no cesaba del enemigo.
As a result, the regiment suffered some 408 battle casualties. Now that's a huge number. More battle casualties than they have suffered at any other time in the Korean War. And these attacks failed because the regiment was poorly led and it was poorly trained. Now remember, this isn't a regiment composed of men from all over America. It's a regiment composed of men from an island of 40 miles by 100 miles with only 2 million people. These men know each other. Many of them joined together and are childhood friends. So they're extremely traumatized and they're exhausted by this experience.
The 65th lost Kelly Hill to the enemy. Shell-shocked by the Kelly disaster, the soldiers of the 65th tried to regroup. Their morale was shattered, their leadership under scrutiny. In the fall of 1952, the men of the 65th tried to regroup after seeing their ranks decimated in the battle for Kelly Hill. In the aftermath, the Army had appointed a new commander, Chester DeGarve, to lead the regiment.
The new commander looks at the regiment and quickly determines that there has been a great lack of discipline. They're not shaven, their hair isn't cut, they're wearing different pieces of different uniforms, they're carving into the stocks of their weapons.
In an attempt to instill discipline, DeGarve ordered that all vehicles have the battle name of the Borinqueniers removed, and discontinued the Puerto Rican diet of rice and beans served to the troops. He also ordered them to shave off their mustaches until they could prove their manhood.
Los bigotes para el hombre de antes era la hombría. Y yo vi hombres llorar allí. Ahora, yo quiero que me diga si eso no es discriminación lo que él hizo, en donde 200 soldados entre muertos y heridos murieron en el Kelly, que eso sí, estuvieron batallando, peleando hasta los puños.
That's when the abuse was really blatant after Kelly. They took us for training. They said, oh, really intensive training. That intensive training was to run from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening.
Just 2 weeks later, the 65th was sent back to the front lines. The target was another forbidding outpost, Hill 391, now known as Jackson Heights, a steep and rocky section of a larger hill complex called Iron Horse Mountain.
It was at a lower altitude of the rest of the mountain, which was in the Chinese hands, which meant that we were in the same proposition that we were at Kelly, under fire, under observation all the time.
Colonel Carlos Betances, the only high-ranking Puerto Rican officer left, was in charge of coordinating the attack.
I received orders from my battalion commander, Carlos Batanzas, to go to Jackson Heights and to hold it. And that's what we did for several days. The place was indefensible, unsupportable by corps and division artillery, logistically unsupportable, no engineer support, no medical support, no signal support, no support.
Surrounded and outnumbered 3-1 and unable to receive artillery or air support, Jackson and his men were ordered to withdraw from the hill. From then on, it would be known as Jackson Heights, in honor of the colonel's heroic stance. Early on October 28th, de Garve ordered Betances to counterattack with 2 companies. A Company, under Captain John Porterfield's command, and F Company, commanded by Colonel Cronkite, then a captain.
When I got to the top of the hill, I found that there was no place to dig in. It never even entered my mind that we were going to be sent to a rock to hold it, because you can't hold a rock. Not in the tradition of American infantry. We need dirt to dig in, and there was no dirt to dig in. And so my men and A Company's men and everybody that went to Jackson Heights was sitting ducks for the enemy. They could shell us all day long.
It soon became clear that they would only be able to hold the heights if they were backed by sustained artillery fire from the main line. But with dwindling artillery supplies, that support was not coming.
The place was full of dead soldiers. Stench was unbearable. Body parts were everywhere.
There's some confusion as to who's going to stay and who's going to leave. Porterfield and Cronkite discuss this, and as Porterfield leaves, he calls all his officers together to give them their orders. It is just one of those moments in war. A Chinese round, direct fire from Camelback Mountain, hits that group of officers and kills them all. Now the men are totally demoralized. Now many of them are helping others wounded, but the bottom line is they're leaving.
After Lieutenant Porterfield was killed about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I and 4 lieutenants were all the friendly troops that were left on the hill.
La culpa tuvimos todos nosotros que creímos en una bola, un comentario de que nosotros íbamos a reemplazar que íbamos a ser reemplazados por otra compañía y nos fuimos sin esperar órdenes.
Confused and without their leaders, the soldiers gathered in the valley below, where they were confronted by Colonel Betances.
They were in a state of shock. I tried to convince them to return to Jackson Heights, and I used all kinds of arguments.
Entonces fue soldado por soldado. ¿Usted va? Sí, yo estoy. Váyase allí. ¿Usted va? No, váyase allí. ¿Usted va? Resulta que 45 soldados se negaron ahí.
One of them told me, when I mentioned that you can even be shot, the court martial can sentence you to death and be shot. He said, Colonel, I'd rather take a chance and be shot down here than stay up there, and for sure I'll die.
Nos estaba llevando a una masacre. Que si no acabó con la compañía la primera vez, que iba a acabar con la compañía la segunda vez. Y por eso yo me negué.
By nightfall, 40 men from Company F who refused to return had been disarmed and arrested. Also arrested was a platoon leader from Company A, Lieutenant Juan Guzman, accused of refusing repeated and direct orders to proceed to Jackson Heights. Guzman was the only officer of the regiment arrested. The next day, Company C was sent to recapture Jackson Heights. Surrounded by a scene of death, many of the men also abandoned the hill. 50 were arrested. Then, a few days later, while on patrol, 39 men from Company L were also arrested after refusing to follow the orders of an inexperienced officer.
Nosotros conocíamos el tejero y nosotros rehusamos una orden de seguir, porque sabíamos que estábamos perdidos. Estábamos perdidos.
In all, 129 men were placed in stockade. The court-martial charges ranged from desertion to willfully disobeying the orders of a superior officer and misbehavior before the enemy.
Nosotros sufrimos eso y eso nunca se me va a olvidar a mí. Fuimos a verlo donde los tenían en un área cercana con alambre de púa. Imagínese cuando usted no sabe qué le va a suceder y que lo acusen de una cosa como esa en el ejército de cobardía. Y usted no es cobarde, usted es un bravo probado. Eso le va a afectar toda su vida. Estaban bien tristes, estaba ganas de llorar.
Yo no había cometido ningún delito, yo me sentía culpable, porque si me siento culpable, pues entonces hubiese sido peor. Y yo no me sentía culpable, ni me he sentido nunca.
El juicio fue de un día para otro. Ahí no había oportunidad del abogado entonces dialogar conmigo, ver las partes, ver cómo fue, nada. Eso es sentar en una silla y vamos por encima.
Within weeks, the trial started. In less than 2 months, 96 men were quickly and quietly court-martialed. Most of the accused did not testify on their own behalf.
Me dijeron que yo era un cobarde. Entonces el capitán le dijo que cómo va a ser un cobarde un soldado que sacó 2 heridos de la guerra de combate. Entonces ellos bajaron la guardia y me echaron 6 meses.
Of the 96 men accused, 84 were convicted.
Many of them received very heavy, very harsh sentences. 10 years, 16 years, 18 years, very, very heavy sentences.
You cannot run a military operation and have people refusing to obey orders. There are situations in combat that units are actually sacrificed to the enemy fire so that an attack can be successful someplace else. This happens in war constantly. From a purely military point of view, I think it was correct that they be found guilty at the time.
There has to be some kind of a punishment for a lack of that ability to give your life. I know this sounds, to civilians, this sounds bizarre, but that's the function of the military.
Even though Continental officers from 3 different battalions had been involved in the incidents, they were not targeted in the investigation. Instead, Colonel Cronkite was awarded a Silver Star for his actions at Jackson Heights. But someone had to pay for the Jackson Heights fiasco.
Somebody's got to be the fall guy. Colonel Bedard did not volunteer to be relieved from his command. I was not asked, so Betances was the person who was relieved.
Colonel de Garve immediately relieved Betances of his duties.
That is considered a dishonor in the Army. To be relieved from your command is a dishonor. Your career is destroyed from there on. From there on you won't get promoted. I had so many thoughts, and only because I had a family I didn't do it. I would have killed this uncle. And then killed myself. But I thought of my family and said, no, he's not worth it.
In Puerto Rico, the soldiers' letters home touched off a groundswell of protest.
Ante la opinión pública y sobre todo los reclamos de los familiares y amigos de los soldados que no aceptan la acusación de cobardía. Nuestros hijos no son cobardes y hacen que el gobierno de Puerto Rico se involucre entonces y tenga que contratar los servicios de un gran bufete de abogados en Washington, D.C. para defender en las apelaciones a muchos de los soldados puertorriqueños y sobre todo a Juan Guzmán.
These become the largest mass court-martials of the Korean War, and as a result they attract considerable attention.
It was not the first time in war that troops had panicked under fire, said the New York Times. But it was the first mass conviction by a courts-martial for such action. It was also the first case in this war in which men from a unit that had won international recognition for bravery unexplainedly seemed to have changed their character under fire. The news coverage presented a public relations problem for the Army, which had kept the court-martials relatively quiet.
The Secretary of the Army, Robert Stevens, issues a statement saying that the regiment fails because of language problems. The soldiers couldn't understand the orders. We know now that that's an oversimplification. But irregardless, Stevens moves very, very quickly to start remitting, to grant clemency, and to pardon all the individuals involved.
Although the men were not exonerated, the balance of their sentences was canceled after 6 months of prison. Most were restored to service, eventually receiving honorable discharges.
Para mí, las condenas fueron revisadas para crear la ilusión del escenario de un Puerto Rico no colonial. Estados Unidos le había concedido a Puerto Rico un estatuto político denominado Estado Libre Asociado. Frente a las Naciones Unidas, Estados Unidos había comparecido para señalar que Puerto Rico había dejado de ser colonia. Los sucesos de Jackson Heights y las condenas a los puertorriqueños parecían negar esa aseveración.
The appeals of court-martials are argued by lawyers, and so I can see a sharp lawyer saying that it was suicidal to send him out there, and I can understand a court of appeals saying that's probably right, that it was reasonable for them not to go back out.
And when we talk about a double standard in the 3rd Infantry Division, this is what we mean. Because you see the very next month in December, what happens to the 65th happens to the 15th Infantry. And that is the 15th Infantry loses Jackson Heights to the Chinese, fails to regain Jackson Heights in counterattacks, and has a patrol that refuses to go back to Jackson Heights. Those men are not court-martialed. But the reality is, even had that confusion not been there, even had the mission gone as it was supposed to, that day, no company could have held Jackson Heights against that density of Chinese artillery fire.
Jackson Heights and Outpost Kelly were never retaken. Today they sit deep within the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. In the end, the United Nations forces gave up both hills at the peace table.
I consider myself an extra loyal American citizen, proud of my citizenship.
In 2001, a U.S. Army Board of Review concluded that the decision to relieve Colonel Betances at Jackson Heights had been inequitable. Shortly before his death on October 28, 2001, Betances was awarded a Bronze Star. A year later, Colonel Jackson was awarded a Silver Star for his heroic efforts at Jackson Heights. In the spring of 1953, the 65th Infantry Regiment was finally integrated. This marked the end of a practice whose time had passed, but the men of the 65th saw it differently.
They decided to destroy it, and they did destroy it. From 4,500 Puerto Rican soldiers, when they finished, they had only 250. And they would have gotten rid of those 250, only that they didn't have time. The war ended. It was shameful. It was a stigma in the history of the U.S. Army.
As an integrated unit of Continental troops, the 65th continued in the war. After the war, the 65th was permanently transferred to the Puerto Rican National Guard, where its legacy of service in the U.S. Armed Forces continues.
We, soldiers of the 65th, we fought for freedom. And people died for the same reason.
The Korean War was the bloodiest war in Puerto Rico's military history. The island had sent 61,000 of its own to fight in Korea, twice as many men than the U.S. as a whole in proportion to its small population. By the end of the war, Puerto Rico had suffered more deaths than most states in the U.S. One out of every 42 casualties, wounded or killed, was a Puerto Rican. Hundreds of lives cut short, thousands of families affected. Puerto Ricans continue to serve in the military today at higher rates and suffer casualties often at levels disproportionate to their numbers.
Yo sí estoy resentido con el sistema. Yo creo que nosotros necesitamos mejor trato por lo que nosotros dimos cuando en nuestros tiempos dimos el 100% por esta nación.
I was very proud to be a company commander. 65. It's the high point of my life. I would like the American people to realize that we did our share in this Korean War.
Today, except for the memories of a few living witnesses, the events that took place at Kelly Hill and Jackson Heights have all but been forgotten. What is remembered is the long-respected history of the Borinqueneers and the heroic campaign they waged on the battlefields of Korea, bringing pride and honor to the people of Puerto Rico.
This regiment is a cultural icon, and whether Puerto Rico remains a commonwealth, whether it becomes a state, whether it becomes independent, the history of this regiment is closely intertwined with that of Puerto Rico.